Now, what does that word history mean to you?
It needs to be his story.
What does that mean? His story.
His unfolding.
Who's his?
God.
All right. Somebody else. That was good. No one? Do you like history?
Yes.
Yes.
That's two. I'm not doing very well there. What does history deal with?
Past events.
Yeah, actually, if you could read that, that's Harry Stout, who is a graduate of what's now Calvin University, and world's authority, and Jonathan Edwards, now someone in retirement. But I heard him say at a conference one time, so history's about dead people. If you're not dead, I have no professional interest in you. Now, academically, I guess I was a historian. I now academically am more of an anthropologist. And other than archaeologists and some physical anthropologists by and large are interested in the living. Right? Archaeology in a university setting, particularly in the United States, fits under anthropology. And physical anthropology, in other words, studying people as animals and so on, they're interested in ancient times as well. But a cultural anthropologist really is interested in, as long as you're breathing. Historians do look at the past, but both of those fields are interpretive. And I want to talk about, how interpretation happens. And I hope that that'll be a good foundation for all the reading that you do for the next 3 weeks, or these 4 units, but also for the next piece, which I don't even know what it's titled, Joe, but is really culture and understanding peoples and so on. How do we interpret? So those are the topics for tonight and the next 3. I want you to keep in mind what we talk about when you read the sections in the reader, and whatever you're presented with a historian's or anyone's perspective on history. Now, all history is written from a perspective. Fair enough?
Yeah.
All right. How does that impact, let's say, reality? Well, the topics that one studies. Fair enough? I mean, what's important? And related to that is the stuff that one examines. Now, that historian Harry Stout said, I have a job, I have a career at Yale. It's a fairly, highfalutin, fancy place to teach because of the work of 2 people. One named Morgan, the other one named Miller. Some of you may have come across particularly Perry Miller's name in some college history text. He wrote a book, Errand into the Wilderness, which was about the early Puritans in New England. And those 2 professors really built Puritan studies in the United States. Puritans had been neglected really intellectually before. Now, here's what topics do you look at and what stuff. Neither Miller nor Morgan was a believer. All right? Puritans, well, the Lord knows who the true believers are, but I mean, the Puritans were devoutly Christian people. Fair enough? Now, Morgan and Miller were interested in their ideas. Miller, in particular, in trying to understand the development of democratic ideas in what came to be the United States. Now, when you're just particularly starting what does end up to be a pretty big field of study, you can't do everything, right? So, for example, Miller read only election sermons. Those were sermons preached before an election. Does that make sense? He's interested in the development of American democracy and the ideas that supported it. Now, he only had one lifetime and probably not too many graduate students at that point. And so he only read election sermons. This guy's not lazy. These are handwritten, particularly 17th century papers with an archivist looking over your shoulder that you don't mess things up, probably. Now, what if somebody said, I've really studied churches in Grand Rapids, but all I read were Christmas sermons? Now, that would necessarily lead to a false picture, but it would certainly lead to a partial one, wouldn't it? Come on, yeah. Stout is a devout Christian person. He was raised in the Orthodox Presbyterian Church. He's wired to be a rather conservative theological person. He said, I have to read a whole lot more than just those. And so he says, 10 hours a day, 6 days a week in the State Archives of Connecticut. See, it takes 6 years to get tenure, right, in a university? And he published the groundbreaking book, which didn't say everything that Miller and Morgan said was wrong. It's just that it was a very partial picture of the Puritans. And the book is The New England Soul. So, just remember little pieces of that. The topics that Harry said, if I want to understand the Puritans, I have to do more than just read the election sermons. I have to know what they were hearing from week to week, plus a lot of other things. What one sees as evidence. What convinces you? What convinces you? What are you looking for? How do you interpret that evidence? And you can't walk around constantly thinking about everything. So what do? You have to frame things. Yeah? If nothing else, beginning, middle, end. Early American history, early colonial history. You have to frame things in some way. Where do those frames come from? We'll see that a little bit later. Just maybe one other example. And in that handout, believe me, I'm not going through every last thing in there. In fact, I put stuff in the handout so I wouldn't have to. But in the back, there are two areas of mission history that, let's say when I was in college in the early 70s, were pretty neglected. So turn to page 17. Women.
Thank you.
Well, surely, this is being broadly ecumenical, so taking into account Roman Catholic missions, well over half of all missionaries historically have been women. Now, a friend of mine, Dana Robert, you would do well, no matter what, to read whatever Dana writes. She's as good a missions historian as is writing today. She did a dissertation at Yale, not with Harry. She may have taken a course, but she was interested not in the Puritans, but really the period just before the start of the 20th century, where there was a lot of ferment. I use the word millennial. Does that make sense? Everybody? See, I'm Reformed. We don't use that word much. I had to learn it, but to bring back Jesus sooner, that's kind of very much in the Perspectives writing. Well, there was great anticipation of our Lord's return in the time leading up to the year 1000. There's some humor there because there was no common calendar. And so it actually happened over a couple of years because they couldn't agree, or they had a different view of what was the year 1000. You find the same stuff leading up to the year 2000. Dana was interested in that. And with a dissertation, you for sure want to survive this. So you pick something doable. And so she picked a person, Arthur Tappan Pearson. You ever heard of him? A couple people. Do you know a phrase attributed to him? Evangelization of the world in this generation. Now, despite Dana's best efforts, there's still a little bit of a question whether he was the first person to use that, but he certainly used it a lot. So what did she do? She sat in the Yale Library. She went to Gordon College because Arthur Tappan Pearson was the second president of Gordon, and the Gordon Archives held a bunch of his papers. And she ground away, and she wrote her dissertation, and she got her PhD. Then she said, now I'm going to study what I really wanted to study all along, which was really the theological, the biblical motivations of American Protestant women in the 19th century. Now, I've teased her and said, Dana, if you'd asked your anthropologist friend, he would have said, you sure you want to do that? And because she had also Dandy Grant. And the problem with grants is they have deadlines. Now remember, Arthur Tappan Pearson, where do you go? Well, you go to the library, you go to the archives, right? Now he wrote some books and he had letters and reports and whatnot, and people wrote about him. Where do you go if you want to study the thoughts of American Protestant women in missions over the 19th century? Where do you go?
Letters.
Diaries and letters, where are they? Attics. You heard this lecture before, I think. You go to attics. Now, thankfully, the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions, which was the Congregationalists, for a while the Reformed Church in America, a few Presbyterians, kept very good records of their missionaries, and they had tried to keep up with families and so on for a while. They were on cards. So, I mean, a little laborious, but she had to track down the families of 19th century women who in their attic, this is New England, everybody's got an attic. And there was a trunk sent back, pick your country, maybe even the Sandwich Islands, which is today Hawaii, all right? By Aunt Sally, 1870. What Dana was looking for are statements like, the reason why this is important is not because I like the weather or I hate the weather or, but God motivated us to do this. That's what she was looking for. She ended up with a fabulous book out of that. It's just that it almost killed her to do it because that was so much more laborious. So why is that important? Well, if you want to read a general history of Christian missions, A History of Christian Missions by Stephen Neal, you don't even have to remember the title.
right? You just tap in on Amazon, A History of Christian Missions, and Mr. Neal's book will pop right up. Is this a good book? It's not a trick question. Yeah, it is. It was written by a guy. Did you hear that in the back? I have to confess some of that. At least culturally, in my frame of reference, men and women are socialized somewhat differently as to what they think is important and so on. I don't even care if you agree with that or not. That's my experience. This is a great book, but this will tell you who done it. By and large, you know, who did great stuff. Any of you read From Jerusalem to Irian Jaya?
Yeah.
If you haven't, I urge you to. My copy's a little beat up. By Ruth Tucker. Ruth, I mean, it's not that she says Stephen Hale was wrong at all. It's a biographical history. She's telling people stories. And she also tells about some really hard things that happened in people's lives. And that everybody wasn't perfect. And so it's a different kind of book. It's biographical as opposed to this happened, that happened, the next thing happened. But also, I mean, it's not so much, it's about human frailty is in here, which I find very encouraging. I may get my numbers wrong, but you know, how many languages did William Carey master? 39, 40, I think I've got it in my notes. It's in there somewhere. He revived the study of Sanskrit. He founded Serampore College. He started a printing enterprise in India. Short version is he was a disaster as a husband and father. Disaster. And, you know, you could say, well, I had trouble mastering English. And then Ilongo, not to mention, you know, reading knowledge of a few, and how could he have done that? I could never. Well, I'm not sure I ever could, but maybe if I totally neglected my wife and kids, I might have a shot at it. You know, fair enough? So, this is a more human book. And in some ways, much more encouraging and inspiring book. You know, Adoniram Judson. What do we know about Adoniram Judson?
He was sick all the time.
Yeah, he was sick a lot, and what else?
He had a weird first name.
I'll give you a big word for it. He was agoraphobic. Couldn't handle crowds. He disappeared from one of the several farewell parties they had for the Judsons and the Newells who were going with him to leave Salem Harbor in Massachusetts. Why did they have several farewell parties? Simple answer. Sailboats can't move if there is no wind. All right? And the guy disappears. His wife didn't worry, because he had disappeared from their wedding reception. You know, he was incredible sitting one-on-one with another person. And I forgot the word, but in Myanmar, Burma, there were not really shrines, but places where a teacher would sit and people would stop. You know, an extreme extrovert would go nuts, I would think, with long periods of time with one individual. That's where he was most comfortable. So, you know, God wires people in all different sorts of ways. So what does one pay attention to? And the like matters. And women were very definitely not written about. And my guess is part of it was, perversity and the sinfulness of the world. Part of it also was, you got to be kidding. I mean, I have to get this book out. I have to get this article out. I can write about some guy in a library. Where am I going to get stuff on women? They didn't do anything. How do I know? I mean, they're not in here. So when you read this, keep asking, what's missing? What's not represented? That's a different question, than asking, is this any good? Yes, it is. But it's certainly partial. Now, I thought somebody might say with Judson, first missionary for the United States. Has anybody heard that one? Yeah? There is a plaque. It's not true. There is a plaque by, not the wharf that they left from, that's gone. The National Park Service has preserved one wharf in Salem by the Salem Customs House. And it says, from near here left the first foreign missionaries to leave the United States, the Judsons and the Newells. They were the first, when they left, they were Congregationalists. You know what happened on the trip? They became Baptists. So a friend of mine says, yes, they had all that time to study the word. And I said, yes, down in the hold of the ship in bad light. By being reformed. This occasioned a significant problem when they reached India and wrote back to their supporters in Massachusetts. You're going to want to watch this when you write your supporters. By the way, we've become Baptists. And the Congregationalists,
Oh, wow.
which is the start of American Baptist Missions, which has an incredible history in Burma, Myanmar, and elsewhere. But the role of African Americans in missions is another area that was utterly neglected entirely. It's not addressed in this book. It's not addressed in a whole lot of books about U.S. missions. Now, I'm afraid of what Joe would say as to his pick for the first person to leave the U.S. shores for the sake of the work of the gospel. You'll note in my notes that my pick is George Liele, who was an African American who indentured himself to a British Army colonel. A friend of mine who is expert in colonial American history said after the Revolution, a number of free African Americans did leave because they feared that they would be enslaved. And so George indentured himself to a British colonel who was going to Jamaica. And if you go to the archives of Jamaica, I've been past the archives, I didn't go in. I did buy a booklet on George, though, is the will left by George and his wife. I mean, there's no question this guy lived and so on, even though I couldn't find real references in American mission history books. Gustav Warneck, a German, for goodness sake, gives at least a page on George Liele and says that at his death, he had founded a church of 3,000 souls. That's not too shabby, and founded the Jamaican Missionary Society. George didn't write. He was pre-literate. He didn't know how to read or write. So his will exists. Somebody else, a lawyer would have written that. So for a while, and you can see in the dates on the books there was a flourishing of interest in study in the involvement of African Americans in missions history. I hope I'm wrong, but I fear that has diminished. So much research gets driven early by money, what you can get grants for. And I fear that's, petered out some, and I think that's a great loss, because I'm sure there are far more things to be discovered. So my point here really is, number one, go all the way to the end of my handout and see what's there. But number two, when we study somebody's interpretation of history, ask what's missing. Now, the writer may be wicked and perverse also, and just trying to fool you, but let's be charitable. Most historians are trying to do a good job of interpreting and representing, but what's missing? What did they not look at? What else could be said? And that ought to make anybody who is going to lecture about history or write about it be pretty humble and circumspect. So how one frames or carves things up, what's missing? And when we frame things, again, what's important to us? You could think about missions history or those eras in terms of theological stuff and the expansion of knowledge. And frankly, in my theological education at Calvin, the history of the early church was told in a number of ways, but there was pretty heavy attention to theological differences in the development of doctrine. That probably does not surprise those of you who are not part of the Dutch Calvin bunch, okay? I mean, that's supposed to chuckle at that. Fair enough. What about geographical and cultural expansion? Influence for education, alleviation of suffering, peace, strictly cultural. The Summer Institute of Linguistics, Wycliffe Bible translators, they live or die by the number of what they term languages, which they have interpreted and carved off. This is a language into which the Bible has or has not been translated. I'm not faulting them for that, but for them, that's a key window. Social. And this shows up very much in the heritage of Ralph Winter. The number of groups in which the name of Christ is known. And if Ralph was here, we'd say, oh, it's more important the number in which it's not known. Because that was the driving passion in his life. So there are probably lots of others, and the point is not you got to pick one. Keep them in mind. But when you're reading what somebody else wrote, what's their frame of reference? Kenneth Scott Latourette, he died in the mid to later 60s. He was a tremendous historian, devout Baptist at Yale. And I really wondered how he could write so much. He did, a 5-7 volume history of Christian missions. He did another big, huge honking book just on church history. He wrote a very early book on the history of the church in China, which I'm told by people who know China history and so on is outdated, but extraordinarily accurate. In other words, you can trust it. It's just that we know more now. How could he have done all that? He wasn't married. No, well, and he lived, oh, come on. And he lived in an apartment at Yale. Well, I used to think, how come it takes me forever to write something. He was also very disciplined.
Yeah.
He wouldn't eat breakfast until he had written so many words. Oh, what's missing here? Just taking those titles, where is there anything
for sure about the church east of, let's say, Jerusalem. Fair enough? See, now, in the Great Century, he talked about the colonial European, North American missions enterprise. Okay? Which showed up in the Philippines very end of the 19th century. But even there, and again, these are good books, great books. They're dependable. In other words, if it says something, yes, it's just that what's missing is the issue. In the Great Century, it is told from a North Atlantic colonial perspective. And the speaker last week, I would have used the word, there are legends of where the apostles went and so on. And I'll point out in my presentation, yeah, there is a legend that Thomas went to India and is buried in Chennai. Beats me. Scott Sundquist, he's got a paper in what you've read, I think in this book, History of World Christian Movement and so on, says there's really no evidence of Christian communities in India before the 4th century. So it could be that there were, but we just don't know about them or what have you. But the gospel did go east. I don't know if Bartholomew made it to China. That's another legend. Somebody got there way before the 19th century. So Latourette, as good as he is and so on, I didn't pick a bad example to beat up. This is as good as it gets. It's great stuff. But nonetheless, there's a whole big piece of the Christian story that's not there. And for those of you who are younger or those retired or about to retire, there's great stuff to study and to learn about. All right, now another thing. One way to look at the past can be called the pyramid theory of history. Ever heard of that one? Everything leads up to me, or to my church, or my part of the Christian family. See, I'm up at the top. See, and then if you talk about ancient times, you're very broad. The olden days, getting a little narrower. Some time ago, we can't include, and you can't even see everything, or the thing part of it, and that was going to be recently, and so you start shrinking down. You don't nod your head. Has your church ever, given that sort of view or presentation? Yeah, why not? Everything leads up to us. Well, one problem with that is, come on, I'm old. I do reasonably well on PowerPoint. I couldn't get a triangle on both sides. But what matters is what's missing. Because down here, you're pretty well taking in everything. The closer you get to the present, in a way that there's more you could well be excluding. Now, another point. Christianity is a mission, a missionary religion. God created all. Jesus is the only way to the Father. The gospel's addressed to all. All are headed to the same new heavens, new earth, or a place of perdition. Right? All. The nature of God's people that we read about, so Genesis 12, or John 20, 21. As the Father sent me, so send I you. Right? Mission means to be sent. That notion of sending is inherent in the Christian faith. Well, I should ask, what other religion has some strong similarities to us? Islam.
You wonder why we. Right? Anybody can become a Muslim. Just like our conviction, anyone can own Christ as Savior. And both don't have a passive view thereof. Right?
Right.
Now I'm a Reformed guy, we're real, I don't know if we're chosen frozen, but some of you come out of traditions that are a bit more vigorous and saying, if we don't get there and tell them, God's gonna hold us accountable. I say the same thing, maybe with a little nuance about election and predestination and so on, but that's inherent in being a Christian person. Yeah. So it's no wonder that we bump into another religion that has a sense of God overall. And because of that, some sense of spread or movement, Perspectives on the World Christian Movement, dispersion matters. How can one follow Christ without concern for all who bear God's image and for his entire creation? How can one claim to follow Christ if one ignores the sentness inherent in life in him? And it's a world Christian movement. So we all write from perspective, watch out for the pyramid, missionary religion. Nothing moves in isolation from its surroundings. So historians of Christian mission seek to understand the work of the Holy Spirit over time, moving the gospel interculturally from group to group, often despite, always in spite of, human sinfulness, ignorance, and ineptitude. And I say that with all sincerity. It's amazing how the gospel has gone around despite, despite or in spite of. I mean, Paul and Barnabas. And why do you think I got gray hairs? Folks, I had to deal with people who would take off on a road that he knows is dangerous. He calls his daughter. One thing I used to look for, though, does the person have curiosity?
Yeah.
If there's no curiosity, stay home, because it's going to be boring. I worked with a guy named J. Christy Wilson Jr. I joined Gordon Conwell. He was born in Tabriz, Iran. He was a missionary in Afghanistan until he was expelled. With the Lord now. But he told me that when he was romancing Betty, his wife, she was a student in New York City, and he was working for what's today InterVarsity. And he took her every date to a different ethnic restaurant. He wanted to see if she was intrigued to eat different food, because he wasn't sure where the Lord was going to lead him, but he figured it wasn't going to be, she actually was from Ontario, I think. If she wasn't interested in eating different kinds of food, if that wasn't fun, this was probably not going to work out. So she, I guess, ate very heartily, and or at least with great gusto. I don't know where it went. She was not very large. This spirit-directed movement of the gospel across barriers, I don't like that word, but that's the best one I had, has happened against the spiritual, religious, social, or over against the spiritual, religious, social, economic, political, geographic, technological, and I added epidemiological background of a particular age. We got 5 minutes. Now you trace Paul's journeys on a current map. Now Paul the traveler did have to deal with shipwrecks, but he enjoyed good roads. You've heard the phrase, all roads lead to Rome? That was probably never said by a Roman. Was said later But there was a monument in Rome to which it wasn't just the all roads led to the city, they all led to that particular place. And they were measured. I think that's where we got the word mile. They were measured out from there. Why did the Romans want good roads, class?
They had an empire.
They had an empire. What do you need when you have an empire?
It's easy to invade.
All right, to invade, but you're so nice. They were sending out orders. They wanted reports to come back, and they wanted something else to come back. Tax money. All right? So, I mean, part of the reason I talk about this stuff is, you know, what in our world is sort of comparable. Paul had great roads to walk on. He did have to deal with shipwrecks. Plane crashes are not a good idea either, and could well be more serious. There were no pirates on the Mediterranean. The Romans called the Mediterranean Mare Nostrum. That's, my Latin is a little bit greater than that, but not too much. That means our sea or our lake. They cleared the pirates off the Mediterraneans. The Romans could tolerate all kinds of stuff. They could not tolerate any challenge to their authority. See, which is the problem that arises in the first century once the Romans figured out that these Christians, we thought were Jews, right? They came from, where's that place? Jerusalem, Judea. We stuck Pilate over there, cold city in the winter. It's terrible. I don't know who we offended to end up there. I mean that. Always revolting. But the Romans kept lists. They had a list of legal religions. They had a list of illegal religions. And the way that you expressed your allegiance to the Roman emperor was to say, Caesar is Lord. You had to do two other things. You had a taste of the libation, and you had to pay a tax. They didn't care what you believed, but you had to say, Caesar is Lord. There was only one religion on the list of legal ones that did not have to do that. What was that? Judaism. How come? So get into the substance of the first century spread. It's estimated that at least 10% of the Roman Empire was Jewish. They were way overrepresented in the Roman civil service. I thought, why? And my professor kind of looked at me like, well, you know, think about it. If you are Jewish, what are you for sure going to learn to do? Read and write. And numeracy skills tend to be very high in Jewish communities. What do government workers do? They read orders, they write reports, and they keep money accounts lined up in things called budgets. Further, if you've been brought up on statements like, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not bear false witness. If that's, you know, if that you're socialized to that, we're not talking about righteousness here so much. I'm sure there's some of that too, but if that's the kind of person you are, plus the Jews were a terrible problem to the Romans in Judea. They couldn't care less what happened anywhere else. They were no threat to the Romans. Make sense? See which other groups of people might have been. They moved around the Roman Empire. They also got vacation. And a number of them went to Jerusalem for the festival season, which starts with Passover, ends with Pentecost.
Those are the people who are shouting Hosanna, which means praise. And somebody said to me, that's really the equivalent of waving the American flag for Americans. It's got political overtones. Praise or hail to the Son of David, the King, right? And what's Jesus riding in on?
Donkey.
Which is a symbol of? I'd like to share my political views, and I would be happy with that one. A lot of people say it's a symbol of humility, hogwash. Jesus was humble. The donkey is not a symbol of humility, it's a symbol of
Royalty.
gentleness. Right? That's from Zechariah. See your king coming gently. One of the guys I worked with, the Gordon Conwell, in terms of Hebrew, and he says, horse is the first century equivalent of an army tank. You ride in on a horse, it's not pride, it's I'm going to take this city by force. A donkey is the first century equivalent of a limousine. I have a right, which in that case was the sober truth. Jesus had a right to the throne of David. Now, I can't prove this, but my guess is that one of those pilgrims said to the other spouse, boy, did we pick the right year to come. Because this is the Messiah. He's going to kick the Romans out of here. We won't have to go back to Rome or Spain or wherever they came from. And that's part of the drama that builds between then and Good Friday, because Jesus he overturns the money changers because there's one place in the Roman Empire you couldn't use Roman coins, at least one. I've never found another. I haven't searched that hard, but I did look a little. In the temple, you couldn't pay your temple tax a Roman coin. My hunch is the exchange rate during festival season went through the roof. That's what Jesus is mad about, not devotion. You turn this into a den of robbers. And if you came from Spain, I don't think you'd take some turtle doves along. You'd buy them locally. And so they're there in the temple. You can buy them. And it's a marketplace, not a place for prayer and worship. Now, the thing is, all that, Hosanna, boy, did we pick the right year to come when they find out Jesus was not going to kick out the Romans. It's not dead. That's the crowd that's shouting, crucify him. That's the crowd that was at Pentecost. It says there were Jews from every nation under heaven. And they heard the apostles speak in their own language. Now my Dutch, I kan een klein beetje spreken, but my Dutch is terrible. And, I said something in class teaching one time, and my Filipino sister here, and one of my close friends to this day will not tell me what I said. It was massive laughter, which means I said something really bad. So those people too, they could get by in Hebrew. That was their language of heritage, but to hear the apostles speak in their own language, these are still Jews. Some of them stayed in Jerusalem, which is probably why the Jerusalem church was always broke. Because they had no businesses there. They had no place there. What did probably the majority of them do? They went home. One historian has said there's nothing more obvious about the early Christians than the degree to which they just got around in the world. So they were business people. They were also Roman administrators who we have no idea who planted the church in Rome. No idea. We know a few that, because, Paul had Luke along to keep track. They went all over North Africa. Some of them may have gone east as far as the Romans had got. And would have gotten somewhat up into what the Romans called Gaul, into France. But no pirates, good roads, dependable trade routes, no national borders. Now here we got our good brother, we have to pray that he gets a visa. Paul did not need visas. And then now we're getting near the end here, currency, couldn't use it to pay your temple tax, but everywhere else, they could take an offering in Antioch, they didn't have to change money to spend that in Antioch of Pisidia. High value citizenship. Not for everybody, but for Paul, and I just didn't want to go back and check all his companions, but Barnabas, Silas, Luke, they're all Roman citizens. And that was a citizenship that had high value. And you can see that in Acts 21 to 28. It's where Paul, gets into this riot at the temple. And the officer, this doesn't make sense, but orders the centurion to flog Paul to find out why the crowd was mad. And Paul waits. It says, as they were stretching him out to bind him. In other words, right at the point where his rights as a Roman citizen would be violated, he says, is it lawful? Right? Is it lawful to do this to a Roman citizen who hasn't even been charged with anything? And the centurion goes to the officer. Centurion's obeyed. So he says the right thing for a centurion. What are you going to do? Not, we have a problem. What are you going to do? Because you ordered me to violate the rights of a Roman citizen. That's power. And we see that also in Acts 16. That's Paul and Philippi. There, Paul doesn't say a word. They put him in stocks. They bound him. They beat him. Right? And all night, they let it go. And then earthquake, the jailer. And it's only at that point that all of a sudden Paul is a Roman citizen. And at that point, the leaders in that city are really worried. Right? Because they wanted him to leave quietly. And Paul says, nothing doing. They're going to escort us out. Luke doesn't say why. My guess is that gave some protection to that house church connected with Lydia. Because otherwise, that house church would have been connected with some guys who were crooks or political troublemakers. So that was a powerful protection. And you imagine making that same trip today. Just, tomorrow you have something, just trace that on a modern map. I gave up trying to illustrate that. In terms of the borders you would have to cross, the visas you would need, the money you would have to change, and the risks that any of us in this room would run in some of those countries. So God, wired Paul. And that environment of the first century, his story, it enabled the rapid, spontaneous spread of the Christian church in the first century and really the next two as well, when things were different in terms of persecution. The Battle of Trafalgar? Anyway, the British defeated the navies of France and Spain. This is part of the Napoleonic Wars and so on. If you know Admiral Nelson, he got killed in this battle. He won it, but he died. Key thing there is that starting then in 1805 to World War II, the British Navy ruled the high seas. Okay? Who took it over in World War II? United States Navy. Who's doing it now? I think I put in here, what does that matter? Well, you can trace the spread of the gospel around the world under the United Kingdom. In spite of the sin of empire and the like, even in places where the British were reluctant to allow missionaries.
William Carey had to go up to the Danish area in India because the Brits didn't want missionaries. Missionaries keep raising issues of human rights. And no, that's serious.
Yeah.
But Carey got to India on a British ship and really within the greater structure. Now, he was actually before Trafalgar, but the growth of Baptist missions and so on. And in terms of technological stuff, the safety on the high seas, the commerce that came out of it, particularly the trade in tea, because the Brits about this time really got into drinking tea big time. They had drunk it before. Much faster vessels. So you get that tea to London quicker. Beat your buddy and make more money. Dependable trading routes. And in missionaries, not only missionaries went out, the idea of furlough crops up about a third of the way into the 19th century. That's not that big a deal, but my point is, think about today and think about as you read history, what were the technical, what were the epidemiological issues involved? Lamin Sanneh wrote a great book on the growth of the Christian church in West Africa. It says the spread of the church in West Africa was not done by colonial missionaries. Life expectancy was under 2 years until somebody figured out quinine for malaria. They died very quickly. Spread came through Africans. They didn't write reports and so on. So it's very hard to recover then. So what are those dimensions today? And we have a pandemic. We have war going on. And we're going to stop there. 10 minutes?
Sure.